All right, everybody, this is part three of our Manifest Destiny series. So, in any case, we talked a little bit about the Oregon and Overland trails in the very first video, but just to touch upon them a little bit more, I think I said already, but bears repeating, that these trails on average were over 2,000 miles long. And again, they're really expensive. They're hazardous. Once you get to the Rocky Mountain passes, you have to deal with very unpredictable weather, high altitudes. If any of your transportation supplies either run out or break, in fact, a broken axle tended to be one of the worst fates that a pioneering family could come across. Frequent skirmishes with Native Americans along the way, you name it, these people faced, right? But nonetheless, over 250,000 people actually did this journey in the 20 years before the Civil War. So you're going to see a fairly rapid expansion of the westward population, most notably in the state of California after that is acquired from Mexico in 1848. But nonetheless, there's a very nostalgic sort of sentiment with regard to the Oregon Trail. I think I mentioned the computer game earlier, but in all seriousness, this is actually a pastoral painting that was created shortly after the end of the Civil War. Obviously, the Oregon Trail doesn't cease in operation after the war's over. In fact, westward expansion only continues with the advent of the transcontinental railroad, that is. But just notice, if you guys are into American art and you want to use this as a point of analysis, just notice the use of color, and in particular the warmth, right? The idea that it seems like almost everything that I can see, at least in this painting, is facing in this direction, which is the west, right? And you could play with the idea of the sun, whether it's rising or setting, and sort of think about how that plays into your interpretation of the painting. But nonetheless, the sense of nostalgia and westward expansion were hand in hand at this period of time. Again, you see the extensive trail networks in this map here, right? Notice that there were a number of different passes through the Rocky Mountain region, and there were different levels of challenges associated with them, and some of them bore more success than others. It's also important for us to realize that you had early mail routes along these journeys, which were very significant, of course. I mean, I think it goes without saying why mail networks were significant as well. The Donner Party. This is sort of, it's not folklore, it actually happened, but if you're from Western areas, you're probably more familiar with the Doomed Donner Party than maybe people like me from the East Coast. But nonetheless, the Donner Party was a group of pioneers who left Illinois. There were about 90 of them who left Illinois in the spring of 1846. They broke off from the original party and attempted a new pass to travel through a new pass through the Rocky Mountains. And when they were in the Sierra Nevada region, so not too far from their final destination, unfortunately, they ended up getting stranded, right? Their axle broke, and they were stranded for 5 months in bitter cold. Allegedly, 5 feet of snow fell on one night alone. And as time went on and members of the party died, they resorted to cannibalism. The remaining members of the party were eventually discovered by search parties, but nonetheless, the Donner Party is sort of in some ways, a cautionary tale, and it's also just a tale to explain the perils and the danger associated with the move west at the time. Let's talk about the Mexican-American War. We'll keep going with this video because I haven't been going too long yet. Let's see if we can get through this. I think we can. So in any case, the Mexican-American War, right? At this point, James Polk, the Manifest Destiny president, is still president, right? And Texas was recently annexed to the United States in this same year, right? And so the major problem that is, that led to the Mexican-American War was a border dispute. Let's go back so you can see it. Between Texas and Mexico. There were two different rivers. There was the Rio Grande River, which is the present day border between Texas and Mexico. And then you also have the Nueces River, which was farther north, which was the border that Mexico claimed. So Mexico claimed that they had more territory than Texas was willing to cede to the Mexicans, right? So in any case, what you end up seeing is that and in addition to the border dispute, obviously Manifest Destiny itself was a major cause of the war. That the U.S. wanted more territory from Mexico, right? And as you can see, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but Mexico was much bigger, right, at this time period, right? California, Arizona, New Mexico, all of these future Western states are still part of Mexico at this point. So the Mexican American War is going to result in a massive cession of territory from Mexico to the U.S. over time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The Slidell mission was ultimately the way in which the U.S. was able to justify declaring war against Mexico. So John Slidell was, for lack of a better word, let's call him an ambassador to Mexico from the U.S. And he ended up surveying this region, right? And ultimately, the result of the Slidell mission was was a skirmish along the border, right? And this ultimately paved the way for the justification of the war. Um, Partially because at first the U.S. offered to purchase this land from Mexico. The Mexican government rejected this proposal in December of 1845. The U.S. then moved to purchase California at any price from Mexico. They also rejected that. And so ultimately, this sort of attempted effort at diplomacy ends up failing, and then the United States government feels the need to intervene militarily instead. So the Slidell mission is sort of this attempt at a peaceful negotiation for land, but ultimately it fails. And so what happens is the U.S. Ends up sort of uh, needing another way to acquire this land, and they need to come up with some sort of military reason to declare war. Because, at least according to the original interpretation of the Constitution, the U.S. wasn't meant to be aggressive towards other nations. They only really were meant to go to war when they were under threat, right? So ultimately, the way in which this goes about, we'll talk about the Wilmot Proviso in a second, but the way in which this plays out is that there were alleged disputes right along the border before the war actually broke out, right? And these were treated as attacks on U.S. soil, and so the U.S. ended up going to war with Mexico thereafter. The war was swift, right? The war was only 2 years long, and the Mexican government, or the Mexican military, was defeated pretty handily. Most notably when General Winfield Scott ends up laying siege to Mexico City and successfully sacks it, right? So nonetheless, in 1848, Mexico ends up signing a peace treaty called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo with the United States, which results in the cession of all of this land to the United States. But let's backtrack quickly to the Wilmot Proviso to understand how this plays into the causes of the Civil War and the question of slavery. Right, so in 1846, before the war is over, of course, this is in the middle of the war, Congressman David Wilmot, who was from Pennsylvania, proposed that any territory that could be ceded from Mexico to the United States should be closed to slavery, right? So basically, the Wilmot Proviso was an anti-expansion provision, right? Again, it's a proviso. It's not a law that is, it's not an executive order, of course, anything like that. It is just a proviso, right? But ultimately, this is going to be rejected in Congress. And so this is going to cause major complications for the expansion of slavery and for westward expansion. And the failure of the Wilmot Proviso could be seen as one of the many causes of the Civil War. Okay, so again, Mexican-American War, incredibly swift, and we see that the result of it again, let's get back to this. So the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the major accomplishment of this treaty, at least by the United States, is that all of this land, called the Mexican Cession, so part of present-day New Mexico and Colorado and Wyoming, and all of present-day Utah, Nevada, and California, most of Arizona, a little bit more is going to be purchased a few years later, from Mexico under the Gadsden Purchase. We can talk about why that is in just a second. But this is the largest acquisition of U.S. territory since the Louisiana Purchase. All right, and the acquisition of California is arguably the most significant because gold will be discovered that same year, and only 2 years after this treaty, California amasses enough of a population to petition for statehood. So this is really, really significant here. So this treaty was obviously devastating to Mexico and much more of a success for the United States. Mexico loses a very significant amount of land with tremendous natural resources And then, of course, it loses this major West Coast connection, very significant port city of San Francisco, which is only going to grow and prosper once the United States takes over, right? And also, of course, just the fact that the United States now has access both through Oregon and through California to the West Coast is going to help the United States economy grow at the expense of Mexico. Right. The U.S. does pay Mexico for this territory. They pay $15 million, the same amount that the Louisiana Purchase cost, which is interesting. And also, any person of Mexican descent who lived in the Mexican cession was automatically guaranteed U.S. citizenship. So that's another reason why this population got big enough for California to become a state so quickly. And in addition, there were a number of American citizens who ended up getting paid uh, because of claims that they had, mainly land claims against Mexico. So they ended up getting money for that as well. The war was, again, devastating for Mexico and much more of a success for the United States. There were significant casualties, although when we think about the Civil War in a few years, these casualties were small change, right? It was expensive, $100 million. This is going to lead to increased tension between North and South because, as you can surmise, the Democrats, right, the party of Polk, was largely in favor of this war, right? In fact, Polk pushed this war, whereas the Whigs, right, the people from places like New England and parts of the Northwest as well, so places like Illinois, they're increasingly opposed to this, largely at least. And so this is going to lead to future sectional tension that will lead to the war. Right, the new territories that end up being brought into the Union are going to raise the inevitable slavery question. Right, this is going to be one. This is going to be an addition of over 1 million square miles of land, and that does include Texas, but still, getting that much more land is inevitably going to beg that question. What will happen with the expansion of slavery, if anything? Will the Missouri Compromise line, for example, extend beyond the Texas border, right? Does the Missouri Compromise organically continue all the way to the Pacific? That is an unanswered question at this point, right? Um, the other question is, how do we preserve that balance between free state and slave state? That's another thing the Missouri Compromise was supposed to set up. And can they continue that precedent after all this new land is added to the Union? You're going to see two popular generals who fought in the Civil War run for president subsequently, most notably General Winfield Scott and also actually Zachary Taylor. But in any case, you're also going to see that Manifest Destiny is partially accomplished as a result of the Mexican American War, right? What better way to exhibit Manifest Destiny than by extending the U.S. borders all the way to the Pacific Ocean, both with the acquisition of Oregon in 1846 and the adoption of Oregon as a state in 1859, and then, of course, the acquisition of California in 1848, right? So this is very significant for westward expansion, that is. All right, so let's pick up with just one more video that's talking about some unanswered questions that's going to ultimately segue us into the outbreak of the Civil War. Then we're going to pick up with a brand new series of videos talking about the abolition movement and the women's rights movement in the 19th century. So stay tuned and thanks.